Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Salyer, previously the CEO at Gigya, the leading provider of customer identity management, currently the general manager of the SAP Customer Data Cloud. Gigya was acquired about 12 months ago into SAP. Really appreciate your time. What I want to talk about is a few things today. First is I've had the privilege of talking to tens, if not hundreds, of CIOs, CMOs, CDOs, and what I've seen is a collection of things that they really care about and trends that are impacting their business at really the highest level. And I think all of these trends point to the growing importance of what all of us do in this room in terms of identity. And so I want to just address some of those trends, talk about how those are changing and growing first. Second is I want to talk about why it's so difficult for the folks I talk to, the CIOs, CDOs, CMOs, to address those trends. And I think it's difficult because the world's changed a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. And the way that our infrastructure operates at a technical level hasn't kept up. So that's really number 2. And finally, I want to provide a framework, a way to think about this going forward of how do we address some of these trends. And I'll close there. So why don't I just jump into it? Now, let's talk about some of these trends. So consumers, customers out there, they desire personalization and customization, right? We all kind of get that, right? If you look at where consumers spend their time, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, even the new winners, right? Uber, Airbnb, all of these provide a customized experience. We're not surprised by that. But what's new is consumers don't want that personalization at any cost, right? John mentioned it. Consumers are tired of creepy. They're tired of it. They're tired of being tracked without their knowledge. They're tired of data brokers, their data showing up on data broker sites and being sold all over the place, right? They're tired of seeing an ad. They have no idea where that ad came from. They're just growing tired of that. And so this doesn't mean that personalization isn't important, customization isn't important. It just has to be done the right way. And the right way is thinking about transparency, thinking about control, thinking about a two-way relationship between the consumer and the business. And we know this to be true, right? If you just look at the news cycle each and every day, we see examples of this coming time and time again. And what's interesting, as John noted, the regulatory environment is actually following this very closely. Usually, I think you don't see close alignment with what consumers want and often what the regulatory environment asks for. But if you look at GDPR, at its core, it's giving consumers rights to transparency, rights to control over their data. I think it's actually asking for the right things. And so here we are, right? We've got a number of these trends, but again, it doesn't mean that consumers don't want to share data. It doesn't mean that consumers don't think businesses deserve to have data. But what it does mean is they need that transparency and control. This was a survey from Accenture that said, almost all consumers, right? 3/4 of consumers said they are willing to share data with a brand if they're given that transparency and control, right? So it's a relationship where a consumer will provide information. In return, they get better products, better marketing, better services, but it has to be done in a certain way. That's really critical here. Now, I would argue we're entering the 4th era of how we build relationships with customers. And this will be familiar to, I think, everyone in this room, but just to kind of walk through it, right? We started in the offline era, where it was really natural. It was just the corner store. There was a two-way relationship between the vendor or the store owner and me as a consumer, right? And that just worked, right? It had personalization natively built in, kind of consent natively built in. Then we went digital. We kind of lacked some of that personal relationship we had in the offline world, but we were kind of figuring it all out. That's fine. We jumped to personalized era, right? Whereas digital, but it was all about personalization. And this is where I think we provide a lot of value for consumers, right? We see the growth of social, but I also think this is where we crossed a line. We crossed a line where as business stakeholders, we tried to do whatever was possible. And it kind of makes sense, right? You try to collect as much data as you can. You try to track users wherever you can, right? You just try to do whatever is technically possible. But we went too far. And I think we're entering this 4th era, which actually in some ways incorporates these previous 3 and goes back to the core tenets, where this is about a relationship between a consumer and a business. This is about trust. This is about a two-way exchange where there's transparency, there's control. I will give you a better product if you share with me, but let's do it under a social contract. That's the era we're entering. Now, why is it so hard, though? I mean, that intuitively makes sense to all of us in this room. Yet, I don't think we're there. I think we'd all agree we're not there. And I don't think it's because business stakeholders don't want to get there, because I talk to so many of them, and they do want to get there. But the challenge is the world has changed. It's changed quickly. Right? If I'm a business stakeholder, I used to just think about digital as web only, and obviously we have mobile, now IoT, the list goes on, right? Voice, so on and so forth. But it's more than that. The average business has become so complex. There's not just one website anymore. There's tens of websites, right? Take Nestle, 2,000 websites and applications, hundreds of business units. This is just a tremendous amount of complexity. And then to deliver on a complex customer journey, these businesses have bought all sorts of marketing tools and sales tools and service tools, all of which leverage data in some way. So it's become really, really complex, right? And I used to just, again, in that personalization era, the identification was probabilistic. I would just track you, it's fine. But that's not okay anymore. It has to be deterministic. You have to allow users to self-identify, raise their hand, right? That takes different tools and tactics. Privacy compliance, we all know GDPR, but we're just at the beginning of this. And we know that, right? This is going to become very geographically distributed. I think it's going to become very granular. So the bottom line is consumers want this personalization, but they want it done right. They want it with transparency. They want it with control. But because of this world that shifted, it's really hard to get there, okay? And I would argue we need to kind of reframe the way that we look at this issue. In the sort of personalized era, it was all about, let's collect all this data. Let's get as much data as we can. Big data, big data. We need all the data. But this is a reframing today. We need to think about individual rights, right? Rights that we give consumers. Right to know what data you have on them. Right to delete data. Right to export data, right? Rights to provide information and to provide preferences. In return, they get better products, better services, better marketing. This is a reframing. This is a rethinking to the way that we digitally connect with our customers and consumers, right? So this is the shift. This is the shift that's happening. Now, here we are, right? So we've talked a little bit about consumers demand customization, personalization, but not at any cost. It's about transparency and control, but it's hard to deliver on. So let me present a framework, a way to start thinking about this as stakeholders in this industry. And what I'll do is I'll use this customer journey that many of us have seen, right? From awareness to consideration to conversion to retention to advocacy. And I would argue we need to think about privacy all along this continuum. We need to think about customer experience along this continuum. And we can break this thing down into three different sort of ways to think about it. First is, how do we allow users to self-identify, to raise their hand and say, I want a relationship with the brand as a starting point. Make that as easy as possible. Provide a great customer experience to do that, number one. Number two is, how do we give clarity to the customer of how their data is being used, allow them to provide consent, and to manage their preferences in a very clear way. And then finally, how do we actually use this information to build a rich profile that's permission-based and drive better marketing, better service, right? Better sales. That's the question. So let's kind of take this one by one. And, excuse me, I'll get a little more tactical here. But I think you can think, going back to that customer journey, right, from awareness to advocacy, I think you can, at the forefront, think about progressively understanding that customer. We heard that term from John, progressive profiling. This is where I'm going to bring that up a little bit. This is the starting point of allowing users, again, step one, to self-identify. First, they're anonymous. An anonymous user, the businesses I've talked to, is worth about 1/5 of someone that has self-identified, where they've actually provided an email address or a phone number. So that value proposition to a business, if they can get a user to raise their hand, is incredibly, incredibly valuable. So that's really step one. And we think about this as light registration. So maybe not a newsletter sign up the first time you hit the site, but maybe when you're looking at a piece of an article related to something you really love, like sports, you ask that user to sign up for a newsletter. Just give you an email address. It's so lightweight, right? That's such an easy thing to think about. Traditionally, something like a light registration where you just manage an email address has actually been managed by different platforms like email service providers. It hasn't been part of the core identity infrastructure, and that's really problematic when you think about the customer journey and starting to manage things like privacy, customer profiles. So this has to be part of the core identity infrastructure that a business offers. And when I talk to business stakeholders, I think anywhere in your customer journey that you can provide value by getting an email address, that's when you want to think about this. So you should layer this throughout the customer experience. And then, of course, as the journey moves forward, you can provide more value for the customer, asking for that full registration. And everyone in this room understands this here, so I don't have to spend too much time. But I think we've thought a lot about how do you provide a great experience, one that's very mobile friendly, one that leverages new authentication mechanisms or not so new, like social login, third-party identity providers, Face ID, one that's secure, so think about risk-based authentication, two-factor authentication, minimizing what data you ask for during this step. I mean, so critical, right? Think about an e-commerce context. So all of this has to be thought through. But again, this doesn't have to be the first place you get to know a customer or consumer. The light registration can be the first place, and then you upgrade that user later. Typically, where there's a light registration or a newsletter sign-up, it's not connected to the registration. It's a really frustrating experience for a customer. It's really frustrating because they already gave information to the brand. These things should be connected and orchestrated together. Now, from there, you've identified the customer. That customer's worth more to you as a brand. It's a two-way relationship. You haven't asked for so much data up front, but that user goes through the site experience. That customer goes through the site experience. And where you can provide value, you can ask for value. So that's where that data exchange and things like progressive profiling come in. And this is both a technology, but more important than that, it's actually like a tactical strategy that we found that we can really help businesses with to think about which are points of collection that you can actually ask for some information. Okay? So there we are. We've thought about this progressive journey, right, across awareness, consideration, conversion, retention, and advocacy. We need to think about the customer experience across this, trying to get users to self-identify. The ROI on this is going from a certain amount of users that register or authenticate or provide an email address or phone number to try to increase that number. And if you can do that, again, each one of those users usually worth 5x someone that doesn't self-identify. It's all about cross-sell, upsell. Now, let's layer in the second component. John referenced this a bit in his presentation this morning, but let's think about the privacy component of this, right? Doing this the right way, asking for consent and preferences of the customer and consumer. This has to be built in along this entire journey. And this is where what I've seen is businesses are just not prepared to handle the sort of complexity, the detail, which consumers expect and actually the regulation demands. So what I'm talking about here is, one is being able to handle the consent or the terms of service acceptance across all the touch points which a business might be accepting users to register or log in. Take someone like Nestle, 2,000 websites and applications, right? If you actually want to have a single view of those customers and their profiles, you actually need to manage consent in a unified fashion, in a unified way. That takes a ton of orchestration. And lawyers are updating terms of service every 3 to 6 months. And according to GDPR, you actually have to reconsent those users and know which terms of service did that particular user accept, right? That's actually a really tough thing to do. But then it goes beyond that. It's not just about consenting to terms of service. It's also about getting that user to opt into which information you can actually use to drive personalization and customization. And then thinking about which channels can I market to that customer or consumer on? How frequently can I market to that customer or consumer on? And keep in mind, these businesses aren't one channel. They don't just have one website. We're talking about every website has multiple touch points, and there could be 2,000 websites, right? You start to get the complexity and how this needs to be managed holistically, but also clearly for a customer across these different touch points. So that's really step 2. Now finally, what is all of this leading to? Well, first, right, we allow users to self-identify across this journey. Second is we get that consent preference management, right? We get the permission to access this information, provide that transparency and control. Finally, it's about unifying this view of the profile information, orchestrating that information to drive better products, better marketing, better services. And here's an interesting fact. So the businesses that we work with typically have a minimum of 15 different downstream applications that need to leverage this information. Often it's hundreds, right? Think about that. And that number is growing all the time. And it's not just the profile information. This is important. It's the consent information and the preference information as well. So large businesses, obviously they're using all these different applications. Like I know one large CPG that has 7 different email service providers. Now they want to have a unified view of the customer. They want to manage preference and consent in one place because they have to because of GDPR compliance. Yet that consent information has to get syndicated to that downstream application that wants to use the data. And guess what? If that downstream application actually learns something where that user removed consent, that has to get orchestrated back to the central profile. So think about the customer service example. Someone calls customer service and says, I don't want you to email me anymore. Well, guess what? That has to get sent to the central system that then has to get sent to the email service provider. It's a huge infrastructure problem. And most businesses are not prepared to do that today. This is an identity problem, right? This is an identity problem. So you start to see how exciting this is for everyone in this room. Like the future of driving great customer experiences across customer journeys are entirely dependent on getting this right. So I go back to the first sort of framework that I presented, right? So we've got this customer journey. Again, I sort of urge us to think about this in 3 ways, right? Providing a great way to identify customers, get that preference and consent information, and then finally leverage that information to provide this better experience. That's how we want to think about it. And just to close the loop with SAP and Gigya, SAP offers what we call the Customer Data Cloud. And the foundation of the Customer Data Cloud is on Gigya, although we've expanded quite a bit in the last 12 months because we think this problem is actually bigger and broader than, I think, specifically an authentication problem. We think about this much more broadly, where we actually offer 3 different offerings. First is customer identity, which is that helping customers, consumers to self-identify in a way that provides a great customer experience through registration, login. Customer consent, that's really about helping businesses become GDPR compliant, provide that consent management, preference management, give consumers transparency and control. Customer profile, right? Or storing and managing that permission-based customer information, that consent information, orchestrating it to those 15 to hundreds of downstream applications. So what I'll leave you with is, I think what's really exciting to me, I'll go back to kind of how I started. When I talk to just so many business stakeholders, so many CIOs, so many CMOs, even CEOs, they care about customer experience. They care about privacy deeply. Right? They care about these things we're talking about in this room. The industry, when I say the industry, the world will not get this right unless we get identity right, specifically customer identity. We get preference and consent management right? And at the end of the day, it's orchestrating that information to provide better marketing, better services, better products. So my expectation is this industry is going to grow. We're like in the 3rd or 4th inning. I encourage us all today and tomorrow to really think about the business value we're providing, because I think that's fundamentally what will help this industry get bigger and get the importance it deserves. So with that, I'll close, and thank you very much.
Well, we have time for one question.
Oh, sure.
Anybody have a question?
What will be SAP's direction in this area now that you've acquired Gigya? Will you fold it together, or will they maintain their separate service offerings?
Sure. Yeah, so just to give you a sense, they've kept us together. So I'm the general manager of a business unit that essentially Gigya, plus we're growing quite a bit. And the ambitions are the same ambitions actually Gigya has as an independent company. I mean, I think SAP believes deeply, especially because European roots, in this idea of trust. And this idea of a consent-driven data model is the future. It's actually like the future of CRM. It's the future of customer experience. They also know that identity, consent management, preference management does not work if you keep it in a silo within SAP. And SAP is not just within our business, but more broadly is committed to openness. So as an example, we have lots of integrations with Salesforce. And that's not going to change. Didn't change the day after the acquisition. It hasn't changed a year after. And it won't change, I would expect, 5 years after. So that commitment's certainly still there. Answer your question? Okay, yeah, I'll be here after. Yes. Sorry.
So do you see smart devices or even laptops be configured for card-present transactions? You got smart card readers already in laptops. You got NFC. They can be enabled on a smart device. That way, you have a card-present transaction
Yeah. I personally can't speak to that exact use case, and it's something we can follow up after and connect you with our product leaders. But I will say that from our perspective, we're really seeking to be kind of a platform and agnostic to the different authentication mechanisms, and we want to support them all. So, but in terms of the trends that we see, I'll certainly connect you with our team and kind of let you know what we're seeing.
Good.